Welcome to Arts Plus Design Mondays. It's the second in our series devoted to the theme of public reassembly. You can look at the poster here. Some of you have postcards. It's a series where we're mining these terms public and assembly from various perspectives, thinking about what the word assembly means from artistic points of view, political points of view, technological, and also what it means to reimagine the school assembly, our assembly here tonight, at this volatile time. My name is Shannon Jackson. I'm Associate Vice Chancellor for the Arts and Design, and on behalf of my faculty, curators, all of the staff who have helped to coordinate this series, and all of our students who have assisted in developing it, thank you for being here. Special shout out to the students involved in collaborating around Bridge USA tonight. All right, thank you. So we're here and thrilled to welcome you all to Performing Strangers, Revisioning the Political Divide with our brilliant colleague, Arlie Hochschild. Throughout her career, Hochschild has made a habit of writing impeccably researched books that managed to alter our perceptions of the dominant issues of their moment. She's done this every time. So with The Managed Heart, she used an analysis of flight attendants in order to expose the gendered emotional labor that occupies their sphere, and went on ultimately to change how we understand the social theory of post-industrial society. She then, with the second shift, ratified what a few working women suspected about how the laboring lives of women are affected in a domain where they labor both outside and inside of the home. And of course, now she's done it again. With Strangers in Their Own Land, Hochschild wrote the book that many American liberals and progressives and conservatives didn't know they needed to read, a book about so-called red states, about labor, about resentment, and about hope. It's a book also that really carries forward and brings forward another contribution from this great sociologist of emotion, one who is set upon telling the deep story of our political and affective life. She will be joined tonight by students in performance who have agreed to think and feel with us about how the life of the characters in this book affect them and their lives. And Hochschild herself will also begin with some remarks about the course of the book and the next life it might have. So together, this is actually another experiment, an experimental pairing, an experimental assembly, and it really does advance so much of what we seek to do at Berkeley's Arts and Design Initiative, where we're trying to pair research cultures and creative cultures from across the campus in buoyant and bracing conversation and collaboration. So as it turns out, for scholars of the sociology of emotion and for artists of the theater, emotion is very serious business. Emotion is something that connects us, and it's something that separates us. It drives us from within, and it authenticates from without. Emotion is something that can be internally constructed and also internally felt, deeply felt. So tonight, we're going to see a little bit more about what emotion might do. After Hochschild sets the scene, Lindsay Ogle and her team, our theatrical crew, will come onto the stage and offer us a new scene with Aditi, Ramakrishnan, Ciclady Rodriguez, Derrick Duren, and Daryanna Lancet will join us together, and we'll begin at that point a different kind of political theater than we can often find roiling our campus. So, in anticipation of our public reassembly in this theater tonight, help me welcome our luminous and prescient UC Berkeley colleague, Arlie Hochschild.
Well, I love the word experiment and buoyant and brave, and I'm just really thrilled to be part of this experiment, and with in the presence of the actors and actresses here, to be part of this vision of really increasing the cultural breathing space for talking about difference, to not be afraid of it, but in fact to welcome it, to tame it, and doesn't mean we turn into each other, but it means we can talk. And this is especially important at this moment, as we all know, highly polarized political moment. And on our own precious UC Berkeley campus, you know, there are a kind of alarming, polarized attack and defend speakers, right-wing speakers. There are people caught feeling unsure and afraid in sullen silence. And then there are the attackers, you know, those who turn to violence. So what we're doing here, as I see it, is building on Berkeley's rich and precious tradition of free speech, and adding art, and theater, and flutes, and many things. So in my short time here, what I thought it would be useful to do is for me to briefly recap the book, because not all of you have read it, and then to share with you some responses that I've gotten from the book, some extremely moving, and a kind of a burgeoning bridge movement of which this is one part. And then to end, in fact, with what I think of as three potential pillars of activism that we should be invited to consider. So in 2011, I had a moment of realizing that as a Berkeley resident and longtime teacher here, I lived in a bubble, and that all of us do, whichever side we're on, and that I needed to get out of my bubble and find an absolutely equal and opposite bubble. Take my emotional alarm system off and try to scale an empathy wall with people that I knew I would have profound differences with. That was the experiment. And so I ended up in the South, where the right wing has grown the fastest and strongest, and in the super South, that would be Louisiana, and in a heavily polluted petrochemical industry center, where people suffer tremendous pollution, high cancer rate, but oppose regulating polluters. And so I thought, well, I went to this with a question in my back pocket, which is a very commonly shared red state paradox. How could it be that across the nation, it is the poorest states, the states with the worst education, the worst medical care, the most disrupted families, the most pollution, and the lowest life expectancy are also those states that take from the federal government in aid more money than they give to it in taxes, and generally revile the federal government. Louisiana turned out to be an exaggerated version of this. Second poorest state, all those bad rates, 44% of its state budget came from the federal government, and super Tea Party, and overwhelmingly and enthusiastically voted for Donald Trump. So I thought to myself, perfect. Okay, this is what I don't get. And over the course of times, to make a long story short, I realized that the people I came to talk to, some 60 over a 5-year period, they knew about the red state paradox. They were embarrassed about it. And they held it in a part of their brain. We all have this part where you know something, but you disattend it. Oh yeah, we're the Beetle-Obama states. Yeah. Sort of, they knew it, but didn't pay attention to it because something else loomed larger. And what was that? I came to think of that as what I call the deep story. And I think both sides have a deep story. What is a deep story? A deep story is a story about a salient experience that feels true. You take facts out of the deep story, you take moral beliefs out of the deep story. It's just what feels true to you, and it underlies our politics, emotions. And the deep story can be told in almost a dreamlike, metaphoric way as you're waiting in line, as in a pilgrimage, and you're faced up a hill, the top of which is the American dream. And your feet are pointed there, and the line hasn't moved for a long, long time. Most people I interviewed said, we haven't had a raise in two decades. And line isn't moving, and you don't feel in this right-wing deep story that you're begrudging anyone, really. It's just that you worked hard and you're not getting there. And then in this moment, they look like line cutters. Well, who would they be? They would be blacks, and they would be women who, through federally mandated affirmative action, and by the way, I myself am a recipient of affirmative action, I'm here because of it, are finally granted the jobs and opportunities that were reserved for whites and for men. So they even saw the brown pelican that was all oil-soaked, kind of waddle up and sort of cut in line, because he said, those West Coast environmentalists put animals ahead of people. So in another moment of the story, there's Barack Obama, who should be impartially supervising this line. He seems to be waving to the line cutters. Oh, he's their president. Well, he's not going to take care of me. And, isn't he a line cutter? So many people ask me, how did Barack Obama's mother, a woman of modest means, single mom, pay for Columbia and Harvard? Something fishy, then the paranoia kind of. So, and then at the last moment, there's someone who's, let's say from Berkeley, California, highly educated, coastal, turns around ahead of you in line and says, you backward, ill-educated, racist, sexist, homophobic, illiterate redneck. And then you just feel like the culture isn't yours, and a value on religion isn't yours, that you're being reviled, and in fact, the environment you inhabit, the air you breathe, and the water you drink isn't yours either. Strangers in their own land. I ended up with a blue state paradox. How could it be that the Democratic Party, the party of the working man and the working woman, wasn't in fact speaking to the people, mainly blue-collar, high school educated whites, that I came to know? So that in a nutshell was my journey. And after the book came out, I went back to Louisiana and gave them copies of the book, put on a dinner, got their responses to it. One woman came to the dinner with a T-shirt that said, "Adorable deplorables." I'm gonna give you one of these. You have to wear it over there in Berkeley. No promises, Janice. But they liked it, they felt seen. Let me now share with you what my email has been like over the last few months. One young man, 23, began an email message. I live 15 miles outside a small one-stoplight town of 2,500 in rural Virginia. I've lived here in Gretna for all 23 years of my life, save for the 4 years I spent at the University of Virginia. Half a mile deep in the woods behind my house is an abandoned grave of a 19-year-old Confederate private. I found it one day when I was hunting. I was 19 myself at the time, and standing there with a rifle in my hand, I had to reckon with that. How do I reckon with that? Fields that were once full of tobacco now go unplanted. Old plantation homes lay in disrepair. The furniture plant where my grandfather worked is closed down. The textile mill where my grandmother worked has been bulldozed down. The job's gone. Thank you for listening. Maybe I should come to Berkeley. An older woman writes, I'm writing from our farmhouse in Fairview, Kansas. I was sewing this afternoon and listened to a Canadian podcast from 2016 and the Grace video in which you discuss the state of people across America. The number of dairies around here has dropped dramatically over the years. The larger dairies employ a couple of high school boys to work mornings and evenings. The boys go to work at 3 a.m. And after work, they stop at Casey's for biscuits and gravy and bring them to school to eat before the tardy bell at 8 a.m. She goes on to describe the rig truck wash, and several Mexican families that have moved in. She wants to set up a high school exchange program, a high school in the coast. And she says, thanks for listening. A middle-aged woman writes, I'm from northeastern Kentucky. Appalachia is the sister area to Louisiana. I came to Christ in the Methodist Church as a child, and during the charismatic renewal of the 1960s, my mother started to go to a Pentecostal church. My walk with God is personal, every day, and outside of the physical church. My problem as a Christian is this: I find myself on the outside of Christian churches because of the politics that consume them. One last one here. As a female Indian Muslim living in a conservative part of America, I often felt disliked and discriminated against, which led me to hate many of those in my community. Reading your book has changed my perspective and made it easier to share my beliefs to help create understanding and feel more understanding towards those I disregarded. I found in these a kind of bubbling up of activism. One woman said, I'm a member of the Church of the Epiphany in Episcopal Church in Massachusetts. Can you put me in touch with a church in Lake Charles, Louisiana? Another woman says, from Lafayette, Louisiana, I recently started a chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. We're a small group. We've only just begun our advocacy, and I really don't know what lies ahead. And then another from two Berkeley graduate students. They were in energy resources. They bought a bus. They filled it with books about the environment, and they've taken off. I saw them just recently in Baton Rouge, where I was giving a talk, and they were there and planning to go down Cancer Alley in the lower loops of the Mississippi and talk to people. So a lot of calling and reach out. And I've even heard from politicians. I'll just give you one example that I think you've got to bring this guy to Berkeley and do something like this with him. His name is Khanna, who is a Democratic congressman from Silicon Valley. He called me up one day and just said, you know, in my district, we have workers at Google, Facebook, Intel, Yahoo, Silicon Valley. He said half of my constituents are Asian. In fact, I'm Asian myself. But I have made, he said, an alliance with a Republican in Paintsville, Kentucky, whose constituency were unemployed minors and young people who didn't want to leave but didn't have jobs. So Ro Khanna, the Democrat, got a bunch of code trainers to set up an apprenticeship program in Paintsville and to train them over, I think, 2 years, how to write code for apps for cell phones. And the first class of 30 has already graduated to $40,000 a year jobs in Paintsville, which they're promised if they pass. And you know what they call themselves? Silicon Hollow. So there is a lot of room if we create a kind of cultural breathing room to think creatively. There are some leaders already out there. Now, I just want to end with the question of what we do about the empathy wall, cross-partisan empathy wall in this political moment. A lot of us are scratching our heads. And I see three potential pillars of activism. The first, and they're in order of importance, is to take as your purpose the defense of the Constitution, the independence of the press, the legitimacy of the judiciary, the whole system of checks and balances. I think this is now under attack, and that by a variety of means, and it can involve theater, and it can involve poetry, and it can involve writing, and it can involve protests, and it can involve calls. Pillar one, but that would be the purpose. Pillar two, in my view, is to focus on revising, retooling the platform of the Democratic Party, and to get very involved in electoral politics, and that includes getting the vote out. As you know, the vote for blacks, by blacks in 2012 was 66%. It sunk to 59% in 16. So getting the vote out, pillar two. In pillar one and pillar two, you don't have to reach out to the great many Americans who voted for Donald Trump. You can just get busy with that. And you can say, you know, I already know who they are. I don't sympathize with them. I don't even want to empathize with them. Or you can engage in pillar three. And I think the bridge movement is about pillar three. And you can say that I don't have to turn into the person that I disagree with, but surely there are pathways of common ground, and it's worth our while to find out what they are. And you can say, well, look, you know, there, by some estimates, 8 million, by other estimates, 6 million people who in 2012 voted for Barack Obama, and then in 2016 voted for Donald Trump. Who are they? What's their story? What matters for them? What looms large? And what crossover issues could be found? Another group could say, you know what? By some estimates, 1 out of 4, other estimates, 1 out of 3 white, high school educated, blue collar voters would have voted for Bernie Sanders if he had been the candidate, but since he wasn't the candidate, they voted for Donald Trump. What's their story? Who are they? Where are they? Are they some of the people that are writing from Kansas and Virginia? Maybe from not far from here. So 3 pillars of activism that I see here. And I think that whatever we do, whichever pillar we choose to focus on, that it's very important that they be coordinated with one another and that there be a united sort of cooperative system, like the British have a loyal opposition. And that the Bridge Alliance and Berkeley Bridge are, I think, an important part of this. So that in the end, we bring around the change that we need to this culture, our local culture and the national culture, so that none of us ever have to feel like strangers in our own land. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlie. That was wonderful. I'm not going to say too much. Hi, everyone. My name is Lindsay Ogle. I want to welcome this wonderful group of actors to the stage. We've been given the wonderful gift of Arlie's text and have spent a brief period of time experimenting and trying to, much to what Shannon pointed out, connect with the emotion that lies in many of the stories that are made visible in Arlie's work. We have just 3 brief pieces here of the 60 interviews that she conducted, but we hope that by sharing with you the lived experiences embodied here in the performances of our actors, you as an audience might be able to connect more to the deep story of the people in Louisiana, and hopefully we can have an engaged conversation about what it means to try to bridge an empathy wall. So without further ado.
Scene 1, Janice Areno, work. Janice Areno worked hard all her life. She started at age 8 and never stopped. Hard is the important idea for Janice. More than aptitude, reward, or consequence, hard work confers honor. But Janice doesn't base her own sense of honor or that of others just on money. She doesn't base it on how gifted she is in her work or whether her job makes for a better world. At least none of this comes up. If people work as hard as she does, it is a better world. Her feeling about work is part of a larger moral code that shapes her feelings about those ahead and behind her in line for the American dream.
I am 61 and single, but I have a large extended family and I raised my sister's kids like my own. I was born in the middle of the pack, 4th of 6. My dad was the oldest of 10 and my mom was the youngest of 7, and everyone married and had kids. On Daddy's side alone, I have 46 cousins, and on my mom's side, it's about the same. One of my mother's sisters had 11. We were poor, but happy. My mother was a homemaker, but boy, she cooked up a storm morning and night and washed for 8 in a wash house. My father had a 3rd grade education and supported a family of 8. He could do a lot of things, like mend a hole in a fishing net like no one you ever saw. At 19, he learned pipe fitting, joined the local union, and worked for more than 30 years in city service, now Citgo. He was never on disability or unemployment. He could have never supported us all without the opportunity to work at the refinery. After he retired, my parents drove their camper truck to Utah and Colorado, working as fruit pickers, and had lots of fruit. But I'm glad they got the chance to travel before he died. As an 8-year-old girl, I swept the whole church by myself after Sunday and Wednesday services and mowed the lawn. I cleaned out the bathrooms, the boys and the girls, and in the back of the church. My parents would drop me off and pick me up later. I kept that job as I grew older, but added another job at a tasty freeze stand. After high school, I put myself through McNeese, working 40 hours a week as a telephone operator. I worked 1:30 to 10 p.m., 3 to 11 p.m., and 4 p.m. to 12 a.m. It was hard to work long hours and get up to go to school in the morning, hurrying to get your studying in between. I only had 1 weekend a month off. No summers. It was rough. After that, I got a job in the company I work for still. Like my dad, I have never taken a dime from the government. For 5 years, at the telephone company, and for 43 years here, I never one time ever drew an unemployment check or got any government assistance. I did get a small student loan when I was going to college. Back then, the government didn't just give it to you. And I paid every nickel of it back. The sharpest burr under my saddle is people who take government money and don't work. I know guys who work construction who quit so they can draw unemployment to hunt in season. It's the same with disability payments. A friend's daughter has a husband who works long enough to get hurt and then puts in for disability. My own cousins, uncles, brothers have done it. Sometimes there aren't jobs. Then it's great to have welfare. But when there are jobs, why couldn't people mow a churchyard or fold clothes at a care center or clean the school bathrooms? We pay them to do nothing. That's not right. They should do something to help. If you have a job, you should apply yourself to it, even if you face a little risk. 2 of my brothers are pipe welders, and the guys they work with would stop work for small stuff. On the one job, the guys were welding aluminum. It helps to counteract the fumes if you inhale, if you drink milk, so the company brings them 10 o'clock milk. It's in the union contract. Now, if the company didn't bring them their milk at 10 o'clock, 30 guys would stop working. Now, is that stupid or what? It wouldn't have killed them. One day, they could have brought their own milk. Work has a disciplinary function. If there aren't jobs around, well, get people working on the highways, using wheelbarrows and shovels instead of all the dump trucks. When people got home at night, they'd be tired and wouldn't be out drinking or doing drugs. I get that welfare gives some people more than an available job would. You can get an $8 an hour job and maybe clear $2.50 a week. With welfare what it is, it's not worth it to get a real job. I have seen with my own eyes parents driving up in Lexus cars to drop their children off at a government-supported Head Start program. The government is trying to get me to feel sorry for people like that, but I'm not having it. Get a job. Some people think I'm too hard-nosed, but I think if people refuse to work, you should let them starve. Let them be homeless. 10% of the people get 90% of the money. Okay. But if you evened it out in a year, even in 6 months, 10% of the people would still have 90% of the money. A lot of people who win the Powerball, 247 million jackpots, are bankrupt a decade later. They can't ward off beggars and cheats, and they don't know how to invest. We each have to find our own niche and learn to be happy where we are. They used to brag on my dad at the plant that he was so reliable and steady. But what does that even count for anymore?
Like her father, Janice feels proud to have a rooted self, a self based in a busy, dense, stable community of relatives, co parishioners, and friends. But a newer cosmopolitan self, one that seemed uprooted, loosely attached to an immediate community, prepared to know a lot of people, just a little bit, a mobile, even migratory self. This seemed to be coming into vogue. Such a self took pride in exposure to a diverse set of moral codes, but did a person with that kind of self end up thinking anything goes? It was frightening. It was wrong, and Janice was having none of it. Scene 2. Jackie Tabor and the American Dream. Jackie Tabor came from nothing. Growing up, there was so much she wanted and so little she could have, including loving attention. Now, she has a hold of the American dream, but maybe just for now.
I was the third of 5 children to an Irish Catholic family and an abusive alcoholic father who left when I was 8. My mother had to get on welfare. She got a job, then 2, then 3. We never took our problems to her. She had enough on her hands. Eventually, Mom remarried and followed her new husband to Louisiana. But while she worked, we discovered our stepfather to be a dirty, talking, sexual predator. Oh, I stood up to him. We quarreled, and my stepfather told me that if I stood up to him, I would never come back. I was 19, jobless, homeless. I had no address. I found work behind a hotel desk in Dallas, then as a land title researcher for a contractor. I did well in a series of jobs, but I felt lost, kicked out, angry. My entire belongings fit in a suitcase. After my stepdad kicked me out, my sister was the only one who took me in. I'd been in her apartment for 6 months, 6 weeks, and I was treating her horribly. I had 2 jobs, and when I wasn't working, I was in my PJs smoking and drinking. While my sister was at work, I let the dishes pile up in the sink, run up her phone bill, and let the house stay a mess. I lied. Every day I wrote a list. I will not lie. I will save money. I will stop drinking. I carried the list everywhere in my pocket. I meditated on it, and halfway through the day, I'd quit. I felt dead, shattered, broken. I had come from nothing, and I was heading for nothing. One day, while I was at work, I had a moment that transformed my life. I looked out into the window, and it was a beautiful bluebird day. I looked up at the sky and said, "If you really save people, Jesus, will you save me? Because I can't save myself." Then I got up from the ground. I didn't know what I was doing. I walked into the bathroom and looked in the mirror at a completely different girl. She was clean, beautiful. I believe that for the first time, I saw in the mirror how he saw me. He showed me who I am to him. Everything, my marriage, my children, my home, all are a testimony to that moment. Abraham Lincoln was a good man. But if Lincoln walked down the road, he wouldn't see me. Jesus would see me. Presidents? You can't see them. They can't see you. But Jesus is always there. I started to learn the Bible, and it said those who wait on the Lord will mount up on wings like eagles. They will run and they won't grow weary. Those who wait. So that means when everything's right, things will happen. We don't necessarily have to make things happen. I learned from him how to trust him, that good things would happen. Wishing for hard to things to happen can be counterproductive. You have to manage your wishes. Then something good happens. You win a protective husband, enjoy a paid-off house. Our first home was in a one-story townhouse in a pan-flat neighborhood of similar homes with modest trim lawns. We lived there for 8 years when the children were small. Our neighbors were refinery operators, bartenders, machine repairmen, and cashiers from the 3 enormous casinos in Lake Charles. Many worked long hours, emptying the neighborhood of company. We didn't get to know our neighbors, but the kids could ride their bikes. Our second home was in a cul-de-sac in Pine Miss Estates, 10 minutes away. It was in a neighborhood of brick homes with modest shrubs. We built it, then paid it off in 3 years. When we lived in Pine Estates, I always wanted to live in Autumn Run. I wanted that house so badly, but I never breathed a word about wanting this house to my husband. We couldn't afford it. He was working so hard. I didn't want to pressure him. I was ashamed of wanting it when there was no way we could have it. He's never known I wanted that house so badly. But to look at it now, the house's roof is ripped, the paint is chipped, the fence sags. It was destroyed by Hurricane Rita. Now the kids call it Autumn Run Down. I always dreamt of living in Autumn Run, but I wanted it too badly. I told my daughter, what if I had pushed to move to Autumn Run? We would have ended up there when our current house is the house we're meant to be in. This house is beyond my wildest dreams. The home paid off in 3 years when I couldn't imagine less than 30. I told her that Bible passage about not necessarily having to make things happen.
Each house was a step on a ladder to the American dream. On one rung, she had yearned too much for the next, and that was the lesson. In a sense, Jackie's lesson ran counter to the deep story. One shouldn't wish too much for what seems like the next step towards the American dream. That was grabbing. But on the other hand, she had struggled hard emotionally not to grab for it. Our adventure was in coming to understand that lesson. Scene 3, Lee Sherman, Pollution and Industry. The life of one man, Lee Sherman, reflects both sides of the great paradox: the need for help and a principled refusal of it. At age 82, Lee is both an ardent environmentalist and a supporter of the Tea Party.
I was a daredevil kid, one of 7 boys. At around age 7, I roped down a bunch of poplar trees, tied myself to them, and released them so I could fly. I flew pretty high, and I landed in a prickly blackberry thicket. It hurt, but my mom didn't come get me because she wanted me to learn a lesson. I didn't, though. A young man in 1965 with a mind for mechanics and fearless to boot, I made a great fit for Pittsburgh Plate and Glass, repairing pipes, carrying chemicals like ethylene dichloride, mercury, lead, chromium, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and dioxins. When a chloride pipe sprung a leak, I was the guy to fix it. The company didn't do much to warn us about the dangers. The supervisor just gave us paperwork to fill out. My coworkers did, though. They say, "You can't stand in that stuff. Get out of it." I wouldn't be alive today if it weren't for my coworkers. We wore no protective facial masks. You learned how to hold your nose and breathe through your mouth. But one day, I was leaning over a large pipe to check a filter when an operator turned a knob, sending liquid carbonated hydrocarbons through the pipe, drenching me. It was hot, and I got completely soaked. I jumped into the safety shower and had the respirator in my mouth so that I wasn't overcome. The chemical ate off my shoes, it ate my pants, it ate my shirt, and my undershorts were completely gone. Only some elastic from my socks and my undershorts remained. It burned my clothes clean off me. After that, my supervisor gave me a check to replace my clothes for $8. I never cashed it. A day after the acid bath, I was given another job. I was told it was secret, and I did as I was told. Twice a day, usually after dusk, I'd wheel an 8-foot-long tar buggy with toxic waste to the marsh between Calcasieu Ship Channel and Bayou Den. I'd look around to make sure that no one saw me, and I'd check to make sure that the wind was blowing away from me. Then I'd bend down, open the faucet. The toxin would spurt out 20 or 30 feet into the gooey marsh. No one ever saw me. One night, while I was dumping the waste in the canal, I saw a bird fly into the fumes and fall instantly into the water. It was like he had been shot. I put 2 shovels out into the mud so I could walk on them into the marsh without sinking too far down. I walked out and I picked up the bird. Its wings and body didn't move. It looked dead, but its heart was still beating. I grew up on a farm, so I know a bit about birds. I held its head in my right hand and its wings and body in my left. I blew into its beak and worked it up and down. And then it started breathing again. Its eyes opened, but the rest of its body still didn't move. I put it on the hood of my truck, and then I left the bird to go check my tar buggy. But when I got back, the bird was gone. It had flown away. So that was one good thing. I knew what I did was wrong. Toxins are a killer, and I'm very sorry that I did it. My mama would not have wanted me to do it. I never told anyone this before, but I knew how to not get caught. After my hydrocarbon burn, my feet felt like clubs, and I couldn't bend my legs and rise up, so the company doctor ordered me put on medical leave. I kept visiting the company doctor to see if I was ready to come back, but he kept saying I shouldn't come back until I could do a deep knee bend. I took 8 months of medical leave, and then I returned to work. But not long after that, I was fired. They didn't want to pay my medical disability, so they fired me for absenteeism. They said I hadn't worked enough hours. They didn't count my overtime. They didn't discount time I took off for my Army Reserve duty. So that's what I got fired for, absenteeism. They handed me my pink slip. 2 security guards escorted me to the parking lot. 7 years later, I saw one of the men who fired me. We were at Burton Coliseum, the largest public meeting place at the time, and it was filled with about 1,000 angry fishermen. They were all furious with the government, who had declared a seafood advisory warning people to limit their consumption of local fish. When the meeting was called to order, it was standing room only. I could hear murmuring in the crowd. Oh, they were ready to kill the government. A row of company officials, 2 from Pittsburgh Pipe Glass, company lawyers and state officials, all sat behind a table on stage. The state officials stood to explain the reason for the seafood advisory. The fish had been contaminated. Citizens had to be informed. The officials from PPG seated on stage said nothing. So I, uninvited, climbed the stage, faced the fishermen with a large cardboard sign that read, "I'm the one who dumped it in the bayou. They tried to get me to sit down, but I just walked slowly from side to side so all could read my sign. The entire Coliseum went silent. I talked for 36 whole minutes. Someone said, "Sherman, you gotta sit down. It's so-and-so's turn to talk." But another man said, "No, I wanna hear him." I told them I had followed my boss's orders. I told them the chemical had made me sick. I told them I had been fired for absenteeism. The only thing I didn't tell them was that sitting behind the front table on stage was the member of PPG termination committee that had fired me. That was the best part.
Lee had worked at hard, unpleasant, dangerous jobs. He had loyally followed company orders to contaminate an estuary. He'd done his company's moral, dirty work, taken its guilt as his own, and then been betrayed and discarded himself as a form of waste. The most heroic act of Lee's life had been to reveal to the world a company's dirty secret, and to tell 1,000 fishermen, furious at the government, that companies like PPG were to blame. He believed that PPG and many other local petrochemical companies at the time had done wrong, and that cleaning up the mess was right. He thought industry wouldn't do the right thing by itself. But in the role of counterweight, he rejected the federal government. Indeed, Lee embraced candidates who wanted to remove nearly all the guardrails on industry and cut the EPA. Lee had been mad when PPG fired him. But at the same time, the workplace had been where he'd experienced his finest hour, had shown his great skill, his bravery, his endurance, his manhood. And when he added it all up, he was more mad at the government. PPG gave him money. The government was taking it away. Conclusion. In a period of political tumult, we grasp for quick certainties. We shoehorn new information into ways we already think. We settle for knowing our opposite numbers from the outside. But it is possible, without changing our beliefs, to know others from the inside, to see reality through their eyes, to understand the links between life, feeling, and politics, to feel as if. The deep stories of Janice, Jackie, and Lee offer a bridge over our empathy walls, our obstacle to deep understanding of others, one that can make us feel indifferent or even hostile to those who hold different beliefs or whose childhood is rooted in different circumstances. We, on both sides, wrongly imagine that empathy with the other side brings an end to clear-headed analysis, when, in truth, it's on the other side of the empathy bridge that the most important analysis can begin.
While you still are in the clapping mood, I would like to acknowledge Lindsay Ogle, who has drafted these excerpts and put together this script and projected.
Yeah, I think, are we taking just questions from the crowd, or maybe we could start by asking the actors to speak a little about their experience. Is that just to talk about your experience and how this might have informed your ideas about empathy or the empathy wall, and how you think about it in terms of performance?
Yeah, it was really an interesting action to sort of perform in someone else's body, who's not like me in a lot of ways. So it definitely allowed me to sort of humanize Lee Sherman and, think about what it really means to understand a person outside of just their political identity. And I think that's something that's really important to kind of what we're going through now, especially with, all of the events that are happening on campus. And yeah, I think, especially for me, I think the part about the bird that fell into the gunk, was really powerful, and the way that he sort of like became really human in that moment and did what anyone would do, any right-standing person would do, and yeah, that was really eye-opening for me. So yeah, I think I'm still processing a lot of it, but I think it's a good practice, definitely.
I'll be honest. So I didn't know what I was getting myself into, and I almost said no. I almost said no when I went, and I had a moment where you walked out the door, and I was left with the script in front of me, and she said, you have to come in with no judgment, and that was really hard for me. And so I stood there and I looked at the paper and I said, you know what, as someone who's extremely passionate about the arts and theater, I think that one thing that my professor once told me is that everyone deserves their story to be told. Whether you like it or whether you don't like the story, we should have access to listen to their stories. And I said, well, you know what? I'm going to be Jackie. I'm going to show up on Monday, and I'm going to be Jackie for one night and see what that's like. And so so that was my experience. I'm still also processing it, and yeah.
Yes, it is. Okay. Yeah. This, I think, this concept in these stories is they're really important right now, because I don't think the conversation should just stop at I believe this and you believe that. This kind of gets into the why of it all. And like with Janice, you can really, I think Derrick said it perfectly when it really humanizes what can very easily become caricatures or stereotypes. And I mean, she's 8-year-old girl working almost full-time, works 2 jobs in high school, really long hours. Gosh, she pulled herself up by her bootstraps. I mean, it's very, it's good to hear these stories, I think. And yeah.
You know what? I've never done theater before in my life. I'm literally enrolled in an introduction to theater class, like by chance. But then my professor sent out I had never read this book, didn't even know this concept existed. But then my professor sent out an email, and I was like, oh, this looks cool, let me do this. And I'm free Monday evening. But then I'm so glad I did it, because this was so eye-opening for me. This was honestly such an incredible experience. And I'm not American, I'm from India. So I did not even know that there was so much complexity to the political situation here, you know. I mean, obviously, you do know basic things about politics being a student at Berkeley, but there's so much more than what meets the eye, and I think that this was such an eye-opening experience. And as the narrator, I didn't have to identify with the characters. I didn't have to feel what Janice or Lee or any of the characters felt. I didn't have to empathize with them or understand where they were coming from, but I did anyway, because they're such different stories, but they all resonated with me and they made so much sense. And maybe I would not have personally felt the same way had I been in that situation, but I could completely understand where they were coming from. And I think that this was such fascinating perspective. And it just reinforced to me the complexity of human nature, because intuitively, if you think about people who live in a toxic environment and suffer the consequences of pollution every day, as Arlie was saying, you'd think that they'd be rallying for political action, but they're not. And it just reinforced my own curiosity. You know, why are people the way they are? Why do they act the way they act? And I think the whole concept of a deep story really resonated with me. So I'm so glad. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
I think, you know, always in the back of my head now, I have these characters, and I'm always asking myself, how would this look to them? They would be weeping. They would be so pleased at this. They don't feel recognized by people in our bubble. They feel dismissed. And one thing I came to realize is the power of listening. All of these letters I got back, thanks for listening. And it's not a passive act, it seems, and people are hungry for it. I should say that Jackie loves nature. She didn't grow up with it, but she has come to appreciate it. So it was like a strong wish. Clean environment was a strong wish she had to renounce. So it was not stupidity. It was this deep religious act, in a way, on her part. Janice is a toughie. Of all the people I met, I think she was probably the toughest. But she's, you see her busy putting things in the back of her car to give as for a fundraiser for our boys in Afghanistan, and it feels like liberals have kind of forgotten them, the 17, 18, 19-year-olds that are frightened away from home. And she's also gathered materials for the Cajun Navy when Houston was flooded, and says daily prayers for those. So hard heart, but it has a different shape that we couldn't see unless we listened. And Lee Sherman, I just went to visit all these people in the last 10 days, and he doesn't get around very well because the ethylene dichloride did in fact cripple him. And someone wrote a poem about the bird. And I printed it out and got in the car and brought him the poem. And he said, well, I'm going to put a frame around that and I'm going to hang it up in my living room. I asked him about the cuts of 1/3 to the EPA, which includes the information publicly available of the effects of chemicals on citizens. Did that bother him? And Trump has done. He voted for Trump. And he said, some. So maybe we open it up.
Didn't know I was going to get a microphone. Arlie, I was wondering, since you do keep in touch with them, do they still, or do they now appreciate the irony of voting against their own interest in those issues with the chemicals and the pollution and the environmental issues?
They, mixed story here. I would say basically not. They are not jumping up and down about Trump. So there's no more Make America Great, but they'll say, well, give him a chance. You know, he's trying to bring good jobs back, and the Democrats weren't doing it, and give him a chance. That's things are getting in the way. And as for the EPA, they feel that still that regulators tend to be people not from their social class, and they feel that they come in critically and kind of stop the action, and they feel they dislike that. They feel looked down upon. And many see the larger picture. They say, oh, it's really easy to regulate the little guy, but it's the big guys that aren't getting regulated. And they think that the federal government is just a bigger, badder version than the Louisiana government, which is a bought government. It, in fact, is an oil government. And the state does the moral, dirty work for industry by pretending to protect people, but in fact not directing it. None of us here would be very pleased with what the state government did. Actually, I think companies have gotten very brilliant at getting themselves loved and companies and the state hated. And we haven't caught up with the emotional strategies that industry uses. But basically, I would have to say that they are fixed to Fox News and to that version of the truth. And that is kind of why we do need more face-to-face across bubble communication.
I saw that one.
Arlie, you've done a magnificent job with not only the deep story, but enabling us to empathize across that gap with working class whites out of a very different culture. I wonder too whether there's a bridge that needs, maybe the more significant bridge that needs to be made is between white working class and working class of color. And that the deep stories of people of color from the same neighborhoods, essentially, need to be told across. Somehow, those are the real mirrors with each other. We're sort of on the outside in some ways. And I feel that someone needs to do the deep stories for the people in Louisiana that these people keep thinking are being given the benefit. There's also that remarkable recent book called White Trash, The 400-Year History of Class in America by an LSU professor, where she traces back how from the very beginning when whites were brought from England to America, they were the so-called white trash of London. And they were dumped here as indentured servants, and the only thing they were told was, at least you're not black.
Right.
And that was essentially the bargain that's been made with every generation. We'll make sure you're not treated at the very bottom. You're not at the bottom. So there's an investment for them in feeling at least they're not at the very bottom. And that keeps them in some ways trapped in not able to make common cause with the people they really could be with.
Yes, that's right. That's right. That's beautifully said and completely true. And I think that's the next book to write here. How do we do that? Because there is so much common cause. I mean, some of the most hard hit victims of pollution, of course, are along Cancer Alley. These are black townships.
And the hurricane might actually give you the story.
You know, I was in 2 Pentecostal services this last visit, and in both of them they boasted that whites were rescuing blacks and blacks were rescuing whites. So actually, they feel that they believe in good angels, cross race good angels, and they don't feel like racist. I mean, this is the big thing we have to unpack. Actually, these congregations are often, they're white, but majority, but something like 1/4 to 1/3 black. So, you know, when there is a laying on of hands in the Pentecostal service, that was black and white. So it's a more complex story, and I think it's more of a head start, actually, and I think things are a little more straightforward in the South than they are outside it.
Okay, I see a hand over there. As I pass the microphone, I wonder about the Aditi's last line from the script, where you said that we think that empathizing with somebody who's different might be the end of our capacity to be rational or have do analysis, and you think of it as the beginning. And I'm just wondering, as we pass, about exercising the muscle of not generalizing or about being open to that possibility and not being afraid that you would lose yourself in the other. That seems an interesting theme.
Hi. I was wondering, did they ever try to engage you in conversation about your politics? And how did you kind of keep yourself away from that? Or did you? Or how did you deal with that?
Yeah, that's called emotional labor. It's curious. They didn't ask much, actually. I came saying, look, hi, I'm Arlie Hochschild, that hard to pronounce last name, from Berkeley, California, blue, and I teach in the sociology department. And so I know what's going on in my bubble, but I don't know what's going on in yours. So it's completely open. And even worse, they could Google me. So, but no, they didn't ask a lot. Although one, for example, woman asked me this. I had met her at a meeting of the Republican Women of Southwest Louisiana, and she was a gospel singer and a wife of Pentecostal minister in a mega church. And she said, I love Rush Limbaugh. And I thought, holy Christ. Oh, I'd love to talk to you about that. And can we meet for sweet teas? So the next day we're meeting for sweet teas, and she's telling me how she loves Rush Limbaugh because he hates feminazis. So I thought, hope she hasn't read The Second Shift. You know, environmental wackos, and so so I'm trying to be neutral. And what is a wacko? You know, what is a okay? Little Socratic questioning there, and she said, "Is it hard for you? I know you don't agree with me. Is it hard for you to hear what I'm saying? And I said to her, actually, it's not, because I have my alarm system off. I'm not here to tell you about me. I'm here to learn about you. And you're doing me such an enormous favor. I can't tell you how grateful I am in taking me into your world, which she did. And then she said, you know, I know what you're doing. I do that too. I can suspend myself to really be curious and want to get to know another. And then we had that in common and kind of could take it from there. And at the end of that conversation, she said, you know, the truth about Rush Limbaugh is that I feel like he's protecting me from people like you who think that I'm racist and homophobic and sexist and look down on me as ill-educated and that I'm fat. So I learned a lot. And that was how it went. It wasn't mutual, mostly. There was also one more thing I would say. There's a class difference in how people get to know each other. And the upper middle class people will ask a whole lot of questions. Where'd you go to school? You know, what did your father do? Kind of quickly place you, you know. And because you're not going to see that person very, you know, or sustain a connection with them. Whereas they would kind of wait and see who you were. And they kind of expected you to join, you know, the tribe, the community, and hang out. I noticed what they noticed about me. They were curious, but it all were things they observed about how I ate or, you know, my sense of time. It was things they picked up, didn't ask. Yeah, John. No.
No, Tanika's bringing it for you, John.
All right, I got you. So my question is regarding the idea of actually, like, for lack of a better word, I guess, anthropologizing someone, studying someone. Was there any worry that the process of rendering these individuals as objects of study would in some way dehumanize them? And was there any reciprocal animosity with regards to becoming the object of study as opposed to just an individual?
They didn't think so. I think the proof of the pudding was, yeah, you got us. And they actually felt very proprietary about each chapter. Janice Areno would say, well, you got a swear word in my chapter. As if it were, Janice, no, what do you mean? Yeah, no, right here, you know, take it out. No, they felt listened to, I have to say.
Do you have any other tips or advice on how to remove your emotional alarm system?
I think we actually do it all the time. I don't think it's any special magic trick. If you are a parent and you're dealing with your child who's in a, you know, a bad mood, and you're going to say, okay, something's going on there. I don't know what it is. I'm going to listen and get the story. Or if you're dealing with a friend who is in some distress, or any kind of loved one, I think we can suspend ourselves. It's just the only thing that's new is we don't apply that facility to people we consider the other.
Okay. Well, I'll pass one here and we'll give.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the idea of suspending yourself, and like whether during this whole experience of yours that you've ever thought about your positionality, I guess, as like a white woman going into a very like white space, and how that like came into how you operated about that, realizing how people of different races or different genders and stuff like that would be in a very different situation, and how like that was something that you grappled with.
I don't think a black woman or man could have entered the scene in the same way I did. And at least it would take longer and take maybe more skill than I have. But so I think I used my positionality, as you call it. But there are a lot of different positions. White, yes, but what kind of white? You know, I could go in as an ardent right-winger white. And I think the hardest thing for me to manage was being a left-wing white. So I think the trick in this kind of work is to acknowledge your position, of course, and see how people are perceiving you, and then see if you can help them drop it. Because here we had actors and actresses that aren't these people there enacting, but their skill is in helping us drop it. So we really do have leisure. We really do have Jackie. We really do have Janice. And I think it's like that in real life, too. But that's part of the skills of, you might say, a mediator, the skills of a psychologist, the skill of a parent, or any really grown-up. Yeah. And I think this political moment calls on those skills for all of us. So I don't want us to hide behind our positionalities and be delicate about it. I believe in kind of the skills that are brought forward here to be put put to use.
Hi. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the idea of of the deep story, and specifically whether you think the deep stories evolve and change, and if they do, how that happens. And then also whether deep stories tend to be common across communities, neighborhoods, or political preferences, or they tend to be more individualized and personal to your background and experience.
These are social deep stories to which we weld, I believe, our personal deep stories. And the conversations we're talking about trying to create cultural space for, left, right, are from one deep story to another deep story, right? And we've got I have my deep story, it's different from the one I described. But what I have hopes for in talking to Trump voters that could have voted for Bernie Sanders, or Trump voters who voted for Obama last time, for certain subsectors of Trump voters that I think could be very useful to have. I don't imagine a whole psychological melding at all. I'm thinking of strips of common strips of agreement on particular issues. For example, one man that begins the book who was born on a sugar plantation in his childhood and worked in oil all his life. So the old South for his childhood and the new South for his adulthood. He's now in retirement, and Tea Party and Trump. Said, oh, I have to pinch myself. You know, I'm so glad that Trump has been elected. It'll shake things up, this neoliberal direction of giving out goodies that he didn't feel at all helped him and his community. He wanted to rethink that. But he also liked Bernie Sanders. But he once said to me, you know, we have similar kinds of heart. He was kind of trying to figure this thing out. I'd asked him all these questions. He was trying, well, so what is this? He said, well, I think we have similar kind of heart and, you know, left brain, right brain, kind of similar kinds of head, but we have different souls. And I thought, you know, he's right. And then I said to him, okay, will you be a co-detective with me in the sociology of souls? And he thought, whoa, I'm not sure what you mean, but yeah. And that is what kind of led to these kind of conversations about deep premises and how feelings are.
Well, Arlie and students, thank you so much for exercising a variety of skills across stories and across feelings. Students, thank you, everyone, for putting all of these into practice and for challenging the rest of us to join you. Help me thank this crew.
Good job. Wow. Yeah.